So first up, you'll hear from Concita, who has just been awarded her PhD. It hasn't been confirmed, but she has come through her PhD, so congratulations. And she'll be really talking to us about her experiences looking at Chinese Australian mothers. And following that, we have Sarah Marshall, who is currently in her PhD and almost close to the finishing line, and she will be speaking to us from her perspective of working with Chinese and Arabic communities. So some quick housekeeping before we get through. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where feel free to post any questions, and we will have a Slido open as well, and I will share that slide at the end. Concita, is that correct? Yep, but there is the event code. If you wouldn't mind jotting that down, opening up Slido on your phone or device that you're using, and feel free to also pop questions into that. So there's two options. I'll be watching those questions, and we'll have the question and answer session at the end of both the presentations. I think everyone has muted, so thank you very much. And you're welcome to have your cameras on, but if the bandwidth gets strange and your sound quality deteriorates, then I'm happy for you to also turn your camera off. I think I've covered everything, Concita. Did I miss anything?
No, all
No?
good.
Okay, so I'm very pleased to then introduce our first speaker, Concita Kuswaria. So she undertook her PhD at Deakin University. So over to you, Concita.
Thanks, Penny. Hello, everyone. If you have taken your precious time to listen to this webinar, then most likely you are convinced of the importance of breastfeeding. You may also be in a position to support mothers to breastfeed and have experienced how frustrating it can be when the women you're trying to support ended up using formula before they even left hospital. But even more frustrating when it's hard to know how to help these women. So I'm Concita, and I've spent the last 3 years trying to understand how Chinese mothers in Australia feed their baby and why. And also, what can researchers and health professionals do to help? So I'd like to share some of the findings with you today and hope to hear from your perspectives about what these findings might mean to you. So why did I choose to focus on Chinese Australian mothers? Well, firstly, it is the culture that I grew up with and familiar with. But Chinese immigrants are also the largest culturally and linguistically diverse group in Australia. They making up 2.7% of the population. If we count those who have Chinese heritage, the proportion is doubled to almost 6%. Another reason is that Chinese mothers appear to be at higher risk of not breastfeeding. So using data from the National Infant Feeding Survey, my colleagues have shown that there are differences in infant feeding practices between Chinese mothers and the general Australian population. So compared to Australian-born mothers, Chinese-born mothers are more likely to have used formula and introduced it at a younger age, but they're also more likely to be currently breastfeeding. So this data suggests that the Chinese Australian mothers were more likely to be mixed feeding. So what could be contributing to breast and formula feeding in Chinese Australian mothers? Now, reflecting on my own experience, I'm a dietitian, so I'm passionate about good nutrition from early life. Now, I also knew that breast is best, and I was very determined to breastfeed. But when I had my first baby, I ended up doing everything that I didn't want to do. I remember when I brought my firstborn home on the third day, she was just crying all the time. And my mom said, in a matter of factly, give her formula, she's hungry. Yeah, I try to argue saying that I want to breastfeed, but faced with a crying baby, being tired and clueless, I quickly gave in. So to breastfeed successfully, it takes more than knowledge and willpower. The environment matters more. From the literature, these are some of the possible factors contributing to Chinese Australian mothers' breastfeeding practices. So we've got in the individual factors such as knowledge, attitudes and beliefs, confidence and intentions, interpersonal factors like support from family and friends, and also health professionals. At the community level, work, going back to work or breastfeeding in public, and at the society level, the cultural beliefs and norms on breastfeeding and infant growth. So I hope to uncover some of these layers throughout my talk today. So I did three series of studies consisting of a mix of a survey, which is a quantitative approach, and interviews, which is a qualitative approach, to understand more which factors were more important and how they work to influence breastfeeding practices. So the combination of approaches meant that I could get a more complete understanding of the issue. The survey gave me numbers, while the interviews put these numbers in context. So firstly, the survey with 289 Chinese Australian mothers showed that a high proportion of participants initiated breastfeeding. So you can see in the blue bar here, about 93% initiated breastfeeding. But by 2 weeks of age, that rate has dropped quite sharply to about 50, just less than 50%. And again, then at 4 months and to about 18% at 6 months. At the same time, formula feeding, whether partially or exclusively, that's the orange bar, rose from about 7% at birth to 51% at 2 weeks of age. And that goes on peaking to about 75% in the first year. There were also other non-milk fluids creeping in from the early days, and about 20% of mothers introduced solids from 4 months of age. Now, despite the high rates of formula use in the early weeks, any breastfeeding rates remained quite high throughout the first year. So you can see at 6 months, 81% of mums are still breastfeeding. The median duration was 12 months. So this finding supports the data from the National Infant Feeding Survey that Chinese mums are at higher risk of mixed feeding, and further showed that the largest decline happened in the first few weeks after birth. So I was interested to see what factors were associated with both exclusive breastfeeding and early introduction of formula. So firstly, the headings disappeared there, but looking at, this is the factors associated with exclusive breastfeeding to 4 months. So I looked at all the individual, social, and cultural factors. And okay, you can see out of all the factors there, having more breastfeeding control, which is a measure of breastfeeding confidence, and staying in, okay, just a minute, I think, oh, here we go. And staying in Australia for longer increased the odds of exclusive breastfeeding to 4 months. On the other hand, the odds is reduced if mothers intended to mix feed from birth and was not aware of the recommendations of breastfeeding durations or the timing of solids introduction. Similar factors are also contributing to the early introduction of formula. You can see here that the early introduction of formula was most strongly associated with intention to mix feed from birth and having a low family income. While mothers who are not working and has higher breastfeeding control have reduced odds of introducing formula early. And these results suggest that the breastfeeding intentions and self-efficacy were really important in trying to improve exclusive breastfeeding in the early postpartum period, particularly in low-income and or working Chinese Australian mothers. Now, for health professionals in the audience, now you'll be pleased to know that Chinese Australian mothers value information from health professionals the most, followed by their partner, online information, and lastly, their own mother. I find it interesting that their own mother ranked lower than health professionals, and yet they seem to have a lot of influence in infant feeding outcomes. I think this speaks a lot about the hierarchical nature of Chinese families, where children are expected to obey their parents, regardless whether they are 3 or 33. I then delved deeper to explore from selected women about their early feeding experiences. So I interviewed 11 women, all intended to breastfeed, but half of them breastfed exclusively while the other half introduced formula early. And then I compared their experiences. So what I found was that the first few weeks after birth is an intense period where women adjust to becoming a mother, and they grapple with what that means. So breastfeeding could enhance their motherhood identity if they align, but when breastfeeding contradicts the idea of what a mother is or who a mother is, then either breastfeeding is compromised or the mother's mental health is negatively affected. So let me explain what that means. I found that regardless of how these women fed, there were 3 values that dominated their definition of motherhood. So one is, what is the most practical way to do my mothering job? You know, what works? That's the pragmatic group. And then we have the second one, which is to do with, what do I need to do to show others that I'm a good mother? Seeking for social approval. And then the last group is what should I do to fulfill the essence of motherhood? I'll give you some examples. So the pragmatic breastfeeders, this lady, she was actually exclusively breastfeeding, but she had problems with her son who wake up frequently at night asking for breast milk, and also refusing formula. So she told me that she's thinking if she has another child, she might actually get them to breastfeed and formula from the beginning, so that he doesn't refuse formula and therefore wouldn't have any sleep issues. So it's about what works. And then the one about being a good mother. This lady, she introduced formula early, quite briefly, but then her daughter didn't accept the formula, and so she turned into exclusively breastfeeding. But even though she was exclusively breastfeeding, it was a hard time for her. You can see from the quote that she was just trying to survive in that first 6 months period, and constantly having dealing with others' comments about, people say that, that you're a bad mom, and so on. So in her case, even though she breastfed, it hasn't actually, it compromised her mental health quite significantly. And then with the last group about fulfilling motherhood, she actually had a lot of challenges in the beginning, the usual like mastitis, not sure what to do, supply issues, and those sort of things. But on reflection, she actually said that she really enjoyed breastfeeding, made her feel motherly, and it was an amazing experience. So the bigger question about that maternal identity construction is in turn influenced by social and cultural values. Now, to give a bit of context, China has undergone drastic cultural and economic changes in the short span of several decades, which means that the ideas on womanhood and motherhood are far from settled. Historically, China was influenced by Confucian teachings, promoting traditional gender roles of men as the breadwinner and women as the homemaker. During the Cultural Revolution, these ideas turned upside down, where women were treated equally as men, and they were to act and dress like men and work outside the home. Modern China adopts dual East and West approach. The modern Chinese woman is someone who shows feminine beauty and virtues, as well as being independent, intelligent, and competent at home and in the workplace. So these high expectations of women is perhaps not foreign in Australian culture, but China is a much more competitive society due to the huge population. And the pressure for mothers to be successful at home and at the workplace, I would argue, is much higher than experienced in Australia. On top of that, grandmothers play an important role, particularly in helping mothers to recover from birth during the first month, a practice called confinement. Now, in that generation, the threat of malnutrition to children was real, and people generally believe that formula is superior to breast milk. So it's no wonder that many Chinese grandmothers, while they're not opposed to breastfeeding, are quite supportive in the use of formula. So Chinese women are contradicted. They want to do the best for their children by breastfeeding, but they're also conflicted with the intense social expectations to succeed professionally, and often receive contradicting advice from their elders about how to feed. Now, these conflicts, if not resolved, will negatively impact breastfeeding and or the mother's mental health. So how can we support them then? I think understanding about this contradiction and conflicts that's something that we can explore with women and help them to resolve these potential conflicts. So some practical suggestions. Firstly is to enhance their breastfeeding motivation, to really find out what is it for them, how is breastfeeding important for them personally as mothers. You need to probably assure women that their baby needs them more than their boss, at least in the first year. And breastfeeding can help to solidify the transition to motherhood. Then we also need to teach women practical skills on how to breastfeed, help them understand supply and demand cycle, give them lots of encouragement, and show them where to get help. Also promoting social connectedness, so making sure that their partner and the child's grandparents are on the same page. Probably need to discuss with family members about how they can support mothers in the first month. Okay. And if there's opportunity to also explore with mothers as well as their family about what to do in their first month, what do they need to do to fulfill the Chinese culture for confinement, and who's going to do what, and just to align those, there's no conflict in that period. Okay, so that's a very brief go through about the 3 years worth of work, but some of the key messages that I have is just to reiterate that Chinese Australian mothers are highly vulnerable to early introduction of formula, and that our support should be targeting their breastfeeding motivation, self-efficacy, particularly among working mothers and low-income mothers. And it would be best to have a family-centered approach, not just for the partners, but also for any elders who will be looking after the mother or the baby, and to look at managing cross-cultural conflicts to promote greater family and social connections. Thank you. I'm looking forward to hear about your thoughts about these findings in the discussions later on, but my contact details are there if you'd like to continue these conversations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Concita, and I can see you're already getting a bit of a round of applause. That's very great. Thanks, everybody. We're going to go straight to our next speaker, but I have been receiving some questions on Slido, and we have popped the information in the chat box in case you didn't manage to write it down, so please continue using that. So our next speaker then is Sarah Marshall, and Sarah is undertaking her PhD University of Sydney. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Penny. Is my slides are up?
I can't. Can you see them, Concita?
Yes, I can.
Yep, and they're up.
Yep, beautiful. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name's Sarah. I am a dietitian and PhD candidate with the University of Sydney, and I'm very thrilled to be presenting to you all today on, similarly, my PhD project that's been almost 3 years worth of work so far. I'll be presenting on the cultural adaptation of healthy beginnings, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means as I present. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians where I'm speaking to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, and pay my respects to First Nations elders past, present and emerging. So a little bit about me to start. As I said, I'm a dietitian. I trained in Adelaide almost 10 years ago now, and my first job was a community dietitian in the sort of inner west suburbs, which are very culturally diverse. And this was a great learning curve for me. I was probably very green, and I learned a lot about working with diverse cultures, interpreters, food practices, different cultures. And that led me then to move to Timor-Leste, where I worked for a little while, and similarly, just an incredible experience. And this has really led me to a passion in preventative health and health equity. So in Australia, we know from research and looking at access to healthcare services that mums who speak a language other than English at home access maternal child healthcare less than their Australian-born English-speaking counterparts. And you know, this could be for a range of reasons. You know, navigating the system, language barriers. It can be confusing in English, let alone if you're newly arrived to Australia. And so not having so much access to support, as well as many factors around migration and cultural factors like Concita has spoken to, really impact mums' infant feeding practices and the support that they receive around this. So we know promoting healthy behaviours early in life is critical for lifelong health. Of course, breastfeeding is critical to this. Particularly there are behaviours that are obesity risk related. So infant feeding is one, active play, sedentary behaviours and sleep. So we have a number of trials and research programs that have happened across Australia and New Zealand, which make up the EPOCH collaboration. And this has given us such a strong sense of what works, what's effective in Australia and New Zealand, primarily with an English-speaking group of participants. So what we know less about is how to engage and work with culturally and linguistically diverse families. We know from the statistics that there are disparities. Children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are affected by higher rates of overweight and obesity in childhood. And so this disparity is obviously something that we need to reduce. Which brings me to the Healthy Beginnings program, which is one of these research programs as part of the EPOCH collaboration. It's a program that started over 10 years ago now, and it was initially a nurse home visiting program. Nurses would visit mums from their 3rd trimester until their baby was 2 years old, and over stage time points provide information around those obesity risk behaviours, including infant feeding. This showed great success in improving the behaviours, the target behaviours, as well as child weight status. So off the back of that success, the Healthy Beginnings program moved to a telephone-based service, which is still happening today, and these results have just recently been published, which is what's up on the screen there. Interestingly, the participants as part of the telephone-based Healthy Beginnings there was a great representation of mums who speak a language other than English at home. So around 45% of participants. And this is much higher than the other research programs in this space, but reflective of the high migrant population in the Sydney area. So this gave us a unique opportunity to have a look at some differences between mums who were part of the program and spoke English at home versus another language. And indeed, we did see there were differences in how long they engaged in the program and the behavioural outcomes. So this led us to the question, could we modify or culturally adapt the Healthy Beginnings program to improve relevance and those behavioural outcomes among diverse cultural groups. So this cultural adaptation process is sort of an outline of my PhD work. We've had a number of stages that we've progressed through over the time. And this is a model that has had a number of years of research and is established in the literature. You can see the reference there. I won't take you through stage by stage. It is quite detailed and has, as I said, been 3 years worth of work. So I'll give you more of a snapshot of what we did. The first stages were very much consultation based, very formative. We spoke to mums in the Sydney area. We spoke to health professionals, community organisations, a whole lot of important stakeholders across the local health district areas in Sydney working in the multicultural space. And this was all led by the Health Promotion Unit in Sydney Local Health District, who's led by Associate Professor Lim Ming Wen. So we collected a whole lot of information about what are mums doing at the moment, how might the program be adapted, how we might use this information to modify Healthy Beginnings. So the adapted program, as you can imagine, there were some elements that looked similar to the mainstream program and some that, of course, we modified. The things that we maintained were the telephone-based delivery, the staged time points, so 3rd trimester through to 6 months for this trial, as well as the key content messages, so those 4 behaviours, including infant feeding. The things that we did change were primarily around staff. We had bicultural, bilingual staff, and then the support resources that were SMS messages and booklets that went alongside those nurse telephone calls, we culturally adapted. And I'm going to take you through a couple of examples from the booklets, which were then mirrored in the SMS and the way that the nurses then delivered the calls to the mums. So this is an example from the antenatal booklet, and you can see there it's in simplified Chinese, and we had worked from the English Healthy Beginnings booklets to then modify these. So there's a whole process to that, which took quite some time. It was certainly not a straight translation. We worked with a number of bicultural and bilingual staff. We went back to mums to get input on these. So it was quite a long process. But I'll just highlight some of the things we modified around feeding. So we emphasised the recommendations, of course, and we spoke to what mums said was a credible source, being the World Health Organization. They really looked for that, that evidence that this is coming from somewhere reputable and global. And we emphasised benefits for mum and baby. So really worked to some of the things that mums had spoken to in that early work. Similarly, mums spoke about milk supply and some concerns around not enough milk. And I know Concita talked about supporting mums around that supply and demand cycle, which really links in with this. So we added more content around that, the importance of colostrum and those early feeds, and that there may be a delay. And you can see the illustration there around newborn baby's stomach size. So trying to illustrate that those first few days, baby probably won't have a whole lot because their stomachs are so small. So really trying to provide some extra support for that critical early couple of weeks. Just to jump over still in the feeding space, this is from the 4 to 6 month booklet. We worked to pull back on a lot of text and we made changes around the way things were worded and tried to make it much more visual. Again, recommendations around introducing foods around 6 months. We put more content around baby feeding cues, and you can see the images there. And mums talked about sometimes being worried about the baby making a mess when they were feeding. We tried to, use a joyful picture to sort of illustrate that that's part of development and those skills to feed themselves. And similarly, on the other page, we drew from some great work at Sydney Local Health District around the textures from 6 to 12 months that were culturally relevant foods. should also highlight, they're on the slides, but you can access these booklets from the Healthy Beginnings website, which is on the slide there. So where do we go from here? We pilot tested this adapted program with over 160 mums, both from Arabic and Chinese speaking backgrounds. That they were recruited around the third trimester and stayed with the program until their baby was 6 months old. We asked them to complete surveys before and after, and then we invited mums to participate in an interview after they'd finished the intervention. So we ended up speaking with around 40 plus mums who'd participated in the intervention to get a real strong sense of their experience. And for this pilot, our outcome measures were really focused around feasibility. So can we recruit? Will parents stay involved? And is acceptable? What do mums think? Do they like this? And really, does it have legs to move to the next stage? So I have pages and pages of wonderful quotes. I've just pulled out a couple here, particularly around feeding. So we've got an Arabic speaking mum on the left saying, I was quite happy to talk to the nurse. She made me feel comfortable and helped a great deal. She mainly helped with breastfeeding, what food for baby to eat, and what to do if baby's not sleeping. And then similarly from one of the Chinese mums, also around that early time, the call just after birth was very useful with feeding and sleeping. I had no idea. The nurse helped with many questions, and it was especially helpful in Mandarin. So there's just two illustrations from what the kind of things mums were telling us. And for mums who had received most of those calls, they really valued the bicultural nurse being able to speak to them in their language. Even if they did have some level of English, they were just thrilled to be able to speak in their mother tongue. And sort of is one of the key findings from mums who participated and from those interviews. So that nurse call, not only being able to get some individualized support, so when mums had questions and they needed some problem solving, they really appreciated that nurse support in language that was also culturally sensitive. So with an understanding of their family background perhaps and their home situation. Mums mostly said the advice over the phone was very convenient. They liked not having to get to a centre, find transport, organise that side of things. And alongside this, the fact that it was an outreach service meant that mums could receive the call rather than have to be proactive and try and find out how to access. So those two things sort of complemented each other. The final main point from what mums told us was around the booklets. They really liked having the information that the nurse had given them also in writing, because it allowed them to share this with family members who we know are so important in feeding decisions, and as Concita spoke to, so sharing messages with them and reinforcing new behaviours. So we have plenty of next steps for research and next steps for the adaptation process. We really would advocate to move this to the next stage, which is a bigger trial to investigate whether those behavioural outcomes are seen in the adapted program the same way as they were in the mainstream English program. But in terms of practice, learnings that are relevant for maternal child healthcare, particularly with engaging migrant mums, we really see as that active outreach telephone support and affording consultation time for discussing complex issues. Now, I know that's hard, and I know you're time constrained if working in a practice setting, but mums really did talk about appreciating being able to talk to some of their concerns personally in that time as well. The bicultural nurse workforce in this project was really vital, so we'd advocate for that as well as supporting other staff working cross-culturally. And the last point there is around linking MCH services with doctors and local migrant organisations. And the mums who we interviewed mostly weren't accessing their child health centre. They would go to their bicultural doctor, and so or English speaking doctor sometimes. And so enhancing the linkages there, as well as migrant organisations, especially settlement organisations when mums are newly arrived. So I'd like to say a very big thanks to the participants and the many contributors to this project, and I'm very grateful to be part of it and to present on behalf of everyone today. And yeah, very happy to receive any queries on email, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. And this is probably a good opportunity for us to give everybody, or both our speakers, a joint round of applause. Thank you very much for really interesting presentations, very insightful. I'm going to share the Slido screen now. Are you able to see that, Concita and Sarah?
Yep.
Yep, great. So we've had a few questions, and well, a couple of questions and a couple of people saying thank you very much. So I might just pop those off. Well, most of them here are for Concita, but I think people are probably thinking through Sarah's question. So while I give everybody a chance to think through Sarah and pop their questions on, I might take the liberty to ask the first question. So I'm fascinated from both the talks. There seems to be a real respect for that person in authority and that medical professional. And just, I thought it might be interesting to hear from your perspectives, and it might link actually with Louise's question on the Slido about who you think those people are that we should possibly be working with in practice, those health professionals, and where they might be situated. How early do we need to get in to talk with those change agents or thought leaders?
Sarah, I think your study really speaks about this. Do you want to comment first and I can add to it?
Sorry, you have to say it again, Penny.
Okay, sorry, I did ramble a bit. So
I thought it was to Concita. Sorry.
No. So if we're thinking about how the health professional fraternity is seen as very, the source of information, even though that there's this tension between that and what the family dynamics might happen, who do you believe are those health professionals that we as nutrition people should be engaging with to ensure that there's this cultural safe practice that occurs?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the maternal child health nurse was really critical, and I think any health professional in that early years space is relevant. Certainly nurses are a go-to as well as doctors, and I would say there's potentially a hierarchy in a perceived hierarchy in health professionals and health professionals' advice, and would certainly advocate for those, the nurse and the doctor being our sort of primary go-to. But I think any health professional working in this early years space is critical to the picture.
Yeah, adding on to that, I think a lot, some of the moms that I talk to, they really look up to doctors to give them information, but they're a little bit harder to access in that I think in the hospital settings, they see more nurses than they do GPs. And when they go home, they might see the GP's help, but the GP might not be as detailed in their information as opposed to midwives or maternal child health nurses. And they also really value lactation consultants, but they don't know as much about them. And some of these participants say, we really need to tell mums about lactation consultants.
Great, thank you. So I might pop back to the Slido. So Louise, I know she's there. I don't know if she wants to ask this question around so much information. Any comments, or did you want me to read it out since you're there?
Oh, well, actually, it is me. I've just unmuted myself. So that was the issue about how do you engage leaders in the community, the ones who are going to make a big difference, the thought leaders in that community, because, how can you make those differences? Concita, I thought you might have some interesting insights into that.
Yeah, I think one of the first steps will be holding webinars such as these to engage, because I think I find it quite difficult to know who's playing in this field, and because there weren't many people, and so yeah, hoping doing something like this will start the conversation about, how do we make these changes, because I think it's not really just about giving more education or contracting somebody to do the education, but it is at a high level, how do we actually approach this issue in the first place? And with Australia being so multicultural, we can't tailor to every single culture, but so we need an overarching approach on how do we approach culturally diverse families as a whole. But I think it definitely need more consultations and discussions about these to hear about from people in the on the grounds, what works, what doesn't, in the practice as well as with the system, to drive some changes.
Concita, when I was reflecting on your wonderful work, so there were several things that going through my mind. You are a potential thought leader in that particular community because you are someone of Chinese background and you have thought about this and you speak so compellingly. But I also realise there are many different communities within that Chinese-speaking communities. There's the communities of grandmothers, for example. There's the communities of, obviously women planning to get pregnant or becoming pregnant, high school age kids, which is where a lot of long-term decisions about breastfeeding are made, and so on. And so maybe it's a broader question about, and Sarah might, anybody working with culturally diverse communities might think, well, how do you need social media that really connects with, women contemplating pregnancy? What are the mechanisms to connect with grandmothers? Who's writing the content that's actually read or listened to by Chinese community? Those people are going to be very important in that. I'd hope that someone like Concita might be someone who can be a thought leader there.
So I think those are future research questions. So all the things that you just listed, Louise. And I noticed there's a question about future research direction, and that's exactly where it's going, to find out more about how to engage this community. And I mean, we don't even know now how do we engage their partners and elders the best way, because I think language barrier is a real problem. And even if we use interpreters, often the message doesn't actually get through. So there's still a lot of things to explore there.
I think that's a great segue. Consider there's a question in the chat, and I don't know if Sue Smith's okay if I put you on the spot, but I thought you might have some really interesting perspectives working with bilingual ABA counsellors, given just this conversation.
Yes, I've been doing it for 10 years. Before that, we trained some Chinese ladies from Hong Kong, and they were absorbed into the North Shore Hospital. So I've just been writing a journal article that's been accepted by the Journal of Vocational Education and Training. So the North Shore have been doing it now for that amount of time, and I'm not quite sure why we're still talking about the same things. One of the problems is too, we do have a federal government that's not doing anything about advertising on television, and someone can understand the pictures, certainly, if they don't want, to speak a good language, but they still pick up that in Australia, bottle feeding appears to be the norm. And so there needs to be a bit more work done on the politics of it. So the girls that I've worked with, I've sat with them in their class, we run community groups, and they do antenatal class at the hospital in both Chinese and South Korean. And so, I've been sitting with them because they were going to doctors. We ran more community-based meetings, similar to what we would do in ABA, except we were doing it in coffee shops. So for the staff at the hospital, or all the hospitals in the North Sydney area health, a lot of them were already trained in ABA and went back into healthcare. And so they are confused because the mums will say, we want a bottle feed. We know, I did a Zoom meeting with the North Sydney Area Health Breastfeeding Promotion Committee, and they also have problems with the young doctors who are giving the wrong advice to the mums. And they look, in their white coat, they look like the expert. And so that needs to be educated about. So they're taking on the New South Wales Health breastfeeding promotion models for all the health area. And so they're looking at different ways that they can promote. And so they're looking also in August, there's the 2nd of August, they're going to do some big promotion on diversity, because they have many languages at North Sydney Area Health as well. So they'll do something on diversity and mums.
Look out for that. Thanks, Sue. Sarah and Concetta, did you want to say anything around, I know there's a question for you, Sarah, around working with bilingual nurses. There's a comment as well around Australian Breastfeeding Association. Did you want to make any comments around the workforce?
Yeah, it's a real challenging one. We did manage to find bicultural child and family health nurses from within the local health districts across Greater Sydney to work on this project specifically. We had them for a day a week, so it wasn't a full-time position, and they were doing that alongside their other roles. And I think, you know, going forward, we would really need to look at the workforce if this was to be sort of scaled up.
I didn't think he's done. He's just come over from.
Sorry, there's someone who's not on mute. If I could ask them to be on mute.
Okay.
Someone's on the phone.
Thank you.
Oh, I think I might have done it. Sorry, Sarah.
No, that's all right. And there was a comment around the GPs and mixed advice as well, which is something Sue mentioned, and certainly something we heard from mums. You know, when the bicultural nurse even gave particular advice, but they'd heard differently from the GP and how they manage that. In terms of the ABA, mums in our group, the mums we interviewed, didn't talk about accessing ABA helpline or support groups, but in the survey, which I'm still analysing, there was some access to those. I can't tell you ABA specifically, but a helpline type support, but not a lot. And I think that is around knowing where to call, who's going to answer on the other line. Is it going to be in English? How do I navigate that? I think that to me seems a real hurdle for accessing that kind of support.
Did you want to add to that, Concetta?
Yeah, in the survey that I did, mums do access helplines, as I showed in that graph. That was one of the things, but the experience quite varied. Some of them, you know, had a great experience, and others say, you know, they had to wait on the line for a few hours, and the person on the other line didn't really quite understand what she was going through. So there's a bit of a communication and expectations issues as well. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just having a look at the Slido. So might be good for us to focus on key messages, and I suppose I found that interesting in terms of, you know, some of the conversation we're having here is there's a lot of mixed messages, and I think we'd find that across the board, and then it's specifically escalated if you're in a different language group and different cultural. But I'd be interested in your suggested key messages then for the workforce, given that, you know, as you said, I think it was Concetta, the GP may not be the first or the main person they're working with. It might be the midwife or maternal child health nurse, but they may be hearing conflicting messages from their GP or their doctor. And then they're going, you know, they're in their own home environment where there's this tension around the family dynamics, I suppose, generational change of culture where naturally the tension between mother-in-law or mother and daughter can play out. And then there might be that acculturation that's happening when you're living outside of your own country. So do you have a suite of key messages that you think should be in the toolbox for the midwife or the maternal child health nurse so that we can improve breastfeeding duration?
I think given that a lot of the problems really started very early, I think the intervention needs to start earlier on during pregnancy. To have those conversations with mums, you know, what do you think breastfeeding is going to be like, to try and align the expectation versus reality of what it takes to breastfeed, and, you know, the kind of sacrifices, I guess, that they have to, there will be other things that they won't be able to do if they want to exclusively breastfeed. So I think starting these conversations early is valuable. We can even start earlier, but yeah, we've got to start somewhere, and probably during pregnancy is a good place because everyone's have to go through the same system. But yeah.
Thanks, Conchita. Sarah, key take-home message or key messages for the workforce?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. I'm reflecting on some of the preliminary work we did with health professionals, the interviews that I did mostly with nurses, and you know, there was a lot of cultural sensitivity and understanding that migrant mums are sometimes conflicted by messages. I think on the flip side, maybe some of the potentially earlier career nurses weren't so experienced with working with different cultural groups. And I think nurses especially reflected on the time constraints and the system constraints to be able to support culturally diverse families. And similarly, mums told us, you know, 15 minutes is too short. I don't have a chance to finish, you know, chatting and going through whatever queries that they wanted to address. And then you put an interpreter in the mix, and it, you know, it's a challenge, and I can see that from a practitioner perspective.
Thanks for those honest reflections. Just having a look at another question here. I think I quite like what surprised you and the team. It might be interesting to see, you know, how do you think we would fare if you don't do these conversations, have these conversations with people of different cultures, different languages, and possibly particularly for you, Sarah, in terms of your thoughts on taking what could be considered a mainstream program and adapting for culture as versus the co-design, start from scratch, talk with the community sort of approach.
Yeah. So considering what we might have done without speaking to them, I can't even consider, because they're so crucial for this process. But in terms of an adaptation versus a co-design, there are similarities and overlap. I think with the cultural adaptation, we really leveraged the years of experience and the evidence-based program that's in existence, and we know has engaged mums who speak a language other than English at home. So I think if in that Healthy Beginnings over the telephone trial, where we had 45% of participants saying they spoke a language other than English at home, you know, if we didn't have that understanding that there was an appetite for this kind of program and they were having engagement through Healthy Beginnings, you know, maybe the rationale for adaptation wouldn't have been as strong. So I think it's also around the program selection.
Okay. Did you want to make any comments, Conchita, around adaptations of programs or creating them from scratch with the community?
Yeah, I think reflecting on Sue's comment there about some of these things have already been done at a local level or at the hospital, but I think we really need to capture these in research and move that forward. So not as a piecemeal approach of, you know, somebody doing this and somebody else doing other things, but to really bring this together in a coordination to advocate to the government, look, we really need to do something, and this is what works. I think unless we have solid evidence on that, it's really hard to make any point to the top. So yeah, definitely keen to keep this field moving, and if there's any other organizations or health services that's would like to continue moving this, we will be very happy to know about that. Yeah.
Thanks. So we have one question there around the evidence. I don't know if either one of you wants to give that one a crack. What's the evidence in terms of exclusive breastfeeding versus the health outcomes for mixed feeding, breast and formula?
Yeah, I can speak to that. In short, yes, there is evidence to show that the benefits of breastfeeding is a dose response. So the more, the longer and the more breastfeeding will give longer health outcomes. So there are a lot of recent papers on that as well. So feel free to get in touch if you want specific papers.
Great. Yeah, so I think we've got probably half a minute left, so, and the questions have stopped, I think, but both speakers did have their Twitter handles there, and I'm sure you can get in touch with them if there's additional information you'd like to hear. But I'd like to thank you again for attending, and thanks to both our speakers for a delightful pair of presentations. And I think we're far from the finish line in terms of big systems issues that we will probably see in the next round of research questions. So thanks again, everyone, for listening, and have a great day.